September 1963, Las Vegas, Nevada. The Sands Hotel Copper Room was filled to capacity with over 600 guests who had paid premium prices to witness what was being billed as the debut of the year, the introduction of a young singer named Catherine Rose Delgado, who had been discovered by talent scouts and groomed for stardom over 18 months of intensive preparation. The orchestra was tuning their instruments, the waiters were serving the final rounds of drinks before showtime, and the atmosphere crackled with the anticipation that always preceded the unveiling of a new voice to the demanding audiences who considered themselves the ultimate arbiters of entertainment talent. Backstage, in a dressing room that had hosted some of the greatest performers in American entertainment history, Catherine sat frozen before a mirror that reflected a face she barely recognized as her own. The makeup artists had transformed her natural beauty into something approaching glamour. The hairstylists had created an elaborate arrangement that added sophistication to her 23 years, and the costume designers had dressed her in a gown that cost more than her father earned in 6 months, working the oil fields of West Texas, where she had been raised. She had been preparing for this moment for a year and a half, had rehearsed every song until the lyrics were etched into her memory with the permanence of childhood prayers, had practiced stage movements until they felt as natural as walking, had submitted to vocal coaching that had refined her raw talent into something approaching professional polish. Everything that could be done to prepare her for this debut had been done, and yet she sat paralyzed with a fear that seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. The stage manager knocked on her door and announced 15 minutes to showtime, a warning that should have triggered the final preparations that would carry her from the safety of the dressing room to the exposure of the stage. Instead, Catherine felt her chest tighten, her breath become shallow, her vision narrow to a tunnel that excluded everything except the terrifying awareness that she was about to fail in front of 600 people who had paid money to watch her perform. She had experienced stage fright before, the normal nervousness that accompanied any performance and that usually dissipated once the music began and the connection with the audience was established. But this was something different, something that felt less like anxiety and more like a physical illness that was attacking her body from the inside, squeezing her heart and lungs with a pressure that made standing seem impossible. The door opened again, this time without a knock, and her manager entered with the brisk efficiency of someone who had shepherded countless performers through pre-show jitters and who expected this situation to be no different. He found Catherine still seated at the vanity, her hands gripping the edge of the table with white-knuckled intensity, her breathing rapid and shallow in a way that immediately concerned him. He asked if she was all right, a question that seemed absurd, given the obvious evidence that she was very far from all right. Catherine tried to respond, but found that words would not come, that the act of speaking required energy she no longer possessed, that something fundamental had broken inside her in the minutes since the stage manager's warning had announced the approaching deadline. The manager called for a doctor, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who recognized that this was not ordinary stage fright, but something that might require medical intervention. Within minutes, the dressing room was crowded with people who were supposed to be preparing for a show, but who instead stood helplessly watching a young woman unravel before their eyes. Catherine rose from the vanity chair, intending to reassure them that she was fine, that she simply needed a moment to collect herself before proceeding with the performance that so many people had invested so much to make possible. She took 2 steps toward the door and felt the room spin around her, the faces of her team blurring into indistinct shapes that seemed to move in slow motion as the floor rushed up to meet her. She collapsed in a heap of silk and sequins, her carefully styled hair falling across her face, her consciousness flickering like a candle in a drafty room that threatened to extinguish the flame entirely. The people around her shouted and reached for her, but their voices seemed to come from a great distance, muffled by whatever was happening inside her body that had stolen her ability to function. The doctor arrived and began his assessment, checking vital signs and asking questions that Catherine could barely hear and certainly could not answer. His preliminary diagnosis was a panic attack, complicated by exhaustion and dehydration, the result of weeks of inadequate self-care during the intense final preparations for a debut that had consumed every aspect of her existence. The stage manager returned with news that could not wait. The audience was seated, the orchestra was ready, and the show was scheduled to begin in exactly 8 minutes. The question that hung in the air was whether there would be a show at all, whether the young woman lying on the dressing room floor would be able to rise and perform, or whether 600 disappointed guests would need to be told that the debut they had anticipated had been cancelled. The decision seemed obvious to everyone in the room except the doctor, who continued his examination with the methodical patience of someone whose primary concern was his patient's health rather than the entertainment industry's schedule. He recommended rest, fluids, and a thorough evaluation before any consideration of physical exertion, a prescription that was completely incompatible with the expectations of the audience waiting in the Copa room. Catherine's manager began making calculations about the cost of cancellation, the damage to her reputation, the contractual implications of failing to perform, the careers that might be affected by the collapse of a debut that had been promoted as heavily as this one. His concerns were valid from a business perspective, but seemed almost obscene when weighed against the health of the young woman who remained barely conscious on the floor. The door to the dressing room opened one more time, and a figure entered whose presence immediately changed the energy in the room. Frank Sinatra had been scheduled to perform in an adjacent venue that evening, and had heard about the crisis unfolding backstage through the network of stagehands and technicians who kept the entertainment machinery of the Sands running smoothly. He had come to see if there was anything he could do to help. Before continuing with this investigation, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in that dressing room in September 1963 involves one of the most dramatic moments in Las Vegas entertainment history, a young singer who collapsed minutes before her debut, and the legendary performer who literally carried her to the stage and helped her find the courage to perform. By the end of this story, you will understand why Frank Sinatra believed that the show must always go on, and why Catherine Rose Delgado never forgot the man who refused to let her fail. Francis Albert Sinatra had witnessed countless performers struggle with the pressures of live entertainment during his decades in the industry, had seen careers launched and destroyed by single performances, had experienced his own moments of doubt and fear that threatened to overwhelm the confidence that audiences expected from a man of his stature. He understood what Catherine was experiencing in a way that few others in that dressing room could comprehend. He knelt beside her on the floor, ignoring the expensive fabric of his own performance attire that was now pressing against the carpet of a dressing room that had seen better days. His face came into focus as Catherine's consciousness began to stabilize, a face she recognized immediately, despite the fog that still clouded her perception of everything around her. He spoke to her in a voice that was gentle but firm, the voice of someone accustomed to commanding attention and directing outcomes, but who was now using that power in service of someone else's need rather than his own agenda. He asked her name, asked what had happened, asked what she was feeling in that moment when everything seemed to be falling apart around her. Catherine managed to whisper a response, describing the terror that had seized her when the reality of what she was about to do had finally penetrated the defenses she had constructed during months of preparation. She told him that she could not do it, that she was not ready, that she had been foolish to believe that someone like her could perform on a stage that had hosted legends, while she was merely a girl from West Texas with a voice that suddenly seemed inadequate to the demands of the moment. Sinatra listened without interrupting, his blue eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that suggested he was taking her words seriously rather than dismissing them as the irrational fears of an inexperienced performer. When she finished, he remained silent for a moment, as if considering carefully what he was about to say. He told her about his own debut, about the terror he had felt stepping onto stages in the early days of his career, when he was nobody from Hoboken, with a voice that critics initially dismissed as too thin, and a presence that some considered too slight to command the attention of demanding audiences. He told her about the nights when he had wanted to run away, to hide in the safety of anonymity, rather than expose himself to judgment that might confirm his deepest fears about his own inadequacy. The people in the dressing room listened in silence as Frank Sinatra, the most famous entertainer in America, confessed to vulnerabilities that his public persona had carefully concealed for decades. he was giving Catherine something precious. The knowledge that she was not alone in her fear, that even the greatest performers had faced moments when they doubted whether they could continue. He told her that the fear never fully disappeared, that he still felt it before every performance, even after decades of success that should have rendered such fears obsolete. But he had learned that fear was not a signal to stop. It was a signal that what you were about to do mattered, that you cared about the outcome, that you were alive in a way that people who never took risks could never understand. Catherine's breathing had begun to stabilize as she listened to his words, the panic that had overwhelmed her receding slightly in the presence of someone who seemed to understand exactly what she was experiencing and who was offering not false reassurance, but genuine wisdom, born of lived experience. Sinatra helped her sit up, his hands steady and strong as they supported her weight during the transition from horizontal to vertical. He asked the doctor for an assessment, wanting to know whether she was physically capable of performing, even if the psychological barriers could be overcome. The doctor hedged, unwilling to guarantee that she would not collapse again, but acknowledging that her vital signs were improving and that the immediate crisis seemed to be passing. The stage manager announced 5 minutes to showtime, a deadline that seemed impossible to meet given the condition of the performer who was supposed to be making her grand entrance. The orchestra was waiting, the audience was growing restless, and the elaborate machinery of a major debut was grinding toward a halt that would damage everyone involved. Sinatra made a decision that surprised everyone in the room, including Catherine herself. He told the stage manager to inform the orchestra that there would be a slight delay, that the show would begin in 10 minutes rather than 5, and that Frank Sinatra himself would be making a brief appearance to introduce the evening's featured performer. The authority in his voice left no room for argument or negotiation. He turned back to Catherine and asked if she could walk. She was not sure, but she nodded anyway, unwilling to surrender completely to the weakness that had brought her to the floor. With his help, she rose to her feet, swaying slightly, but maintaining her balance as the blood that had pooled during her collapse began to circulate normally through her body. Her legs felt unreliable, like instruments she had not yet learned to control, and she gripped Sinatra's arm with a desperation that would have embarrassed her under normal circumstances. But that seemed entirely appropriate, given the surreal nature of what was happening. The most famous entertainer in America was helping her stand in a backstage dressing room, while 600 people waited to see if she could sing. Sinatra asked for water, which someone provided immediately, and helped Catherine drink slowly while continuing to support her weight. He asked the makeup artist to repair whatever damage the collapse had done to Catherine's carefully constructed appearance, a process that required only a few minutes, but that felt much longer to everyone watching the clock tick toward a deadline that had already been extended once. The dress was straightened, the hair was adjusted, and Catherine Rose Delgado was transformed back into something approaching the polished performer who had been scheduled to debut that evening. But the transformation was superficial. Beneath the silk and sequins, she remained terrified, uncertain whether she could walk to the stage, let alone command it for the 90 minutes of performance that her contract required. Sinatra seemed to sense her continued uncertainty and made another decision that would become legendary in entertainment circles. He told her that he would walk with her to the stage, that he would introduce her personally to the audience, and that he would remain in the wings throughout her performance to ensure that she knew she was not alone, even when the spotlight isolated her from everything and everyone else in the room. The walk from the dressing room to the stage was approximately 40 yards, a distance that Catherine had traveled dozens of times during rehearsals, but that now seemed to stretch endlessly before her, like a journey to an execution rather than a performance. Sinatra walked beside her, matching his pace to her unsteady steps, his hand occasionally touching her elbow to steady her when she wavered. They passed stagehands who stared at the unlikely pair. The legendary Sinatra, escorting the unknown debutante as if she were royalty, rather than a newcomer who had just collapsed in her dressing room. Word of what was happening spread through the backstage area with the speed that only gossip can achieve, ensuring that everyone who worked at the Sands that night would have a story to tell for the rest of their careers. The wings of the stage appeared before them, The threshold between the private world of Backstage and the public world of performance, where Catherine would either triumph or fail in front of an audience that had no idea what had transpired in the minutes before her scheduled appearance. She stopped at the edge of visibility, unable to take the final steps that would carry her into the light. Sinatra leaned close and whispered something that only she could hear, words that she would remember for the rest of her life, but that she would never share publicly, preferring to keep them as a private gift from a moment when everything had seemed impossible and one person's kindness had made the impossible merely difficult. Then he walked onto the stage himself, leaving Catherine in the wings as he approached the microphone that had been set up for her introduction. The audience, which had been growing restless during the delay, erupted in applause at the unexpected appearance of the most famous entertainer in America, their complaints about waiting instantly forgotten in the presence of Sinatra's charisma. He raised his hand for quiet, and the room fell silent, with the obedience that his presence always commanded. He told the audience that they were about to witness something special, that he had personally heard the young woman who was about to perform, and that he could guarantee they would remember this night for the rest of their lives. His endorsement carried weight that no amount of advertising could have purchased. But then he did something that no one expected, something that transformed an ordinary celebrity introduction into a moment of genuine drama that the audience would indeed remember forever. He walked back to the wings, extended his hand to Catherine, and led her onto the stage as if escorting a princess to her coronation, rather than a terrified young woman to her professional debut. The audience gasped at the sight of Frank Sinatra personally delivering the evening's featured performer to her spotlight, a gesture of support that communicated more powerfully than any words could have that this young woman was worthy of their attention and their respect. Catherine's hand trembled in his grip, but she managed to walk beside him without stumbling, drawing strength from his presence that she could not have found on her own. He brought her to the microphone, released her hand with a final squeeze that communicated encouragement and confidence, and stepped back to the wings, where he would remain, as promised, throughout her performance. Catherine stood alone in the spotlight, facing 600 faces that waited to see whether she could justify the extraordinary introduction she had just received. The orchestra began the opening bars of her first song, a ballad that she had rehearsed hundreds of times, but that now seemed as unfamiliar as if she had never heard it before. Her cue approached the moment when she was supposed to begin singing, and she felt the panic rising again, threatening to silence her before she could produce a single note. She glanced toward the wings and saw Sinatra standing there, his arms crossed, his expression calm, his presence a reminder that she was not as alone as the spotlight made her feel. He nodded slightly, a gesture so subtle that no one in the audience could have noticed it, but that Catherine received as clearly as if he had shouted encouragement across the stage. She opened her mouth and began to sing, and something miraculous happened in that moment. The voice that emerged was not the strangled whisper she had feared, but the powerful instrument that had convinced talent scouts she was destined for stardom. The song flowed from her as if the panic had never existed, as if the collapse in the dressing room had happened to someone else entirely. The audience responded immediately to the quality of her voice, their skepticism dissolving in the presence of genuine talent that required no apologetics or explanations. Catherine found her rhythm, her confidence building with each phrase as she realized that she could do this, that she was doing this, that the moment she had feared was becoming the moment that would define her career. Song followed song as the set progressed, each one delivered with more confidence than the last, as Catherine discovered that performing was not the ordeal she had anticipated, but a conversation with 600 people who had come hoping to be moved and who were finding in her voice exactly what they had sought. The 90 minutes that had seemed impossible now seemed insufficient to contain everything she wanted to share. Sinatra remained in the wings throughout the performance, watching with the critical eye of a master craftsman assessing the work of a promising apprentice. He nodded approval at phrasing choices that demonstrated musical intelligence, smiled at moments when she connected with the audience in ways that could not be taught, and simply witnessed the birth of a performer who had nearly died before she could be born. The final song of the evening was a ballad that Catherine had chosen specifically because it spoke to her own experience of fear and perseverance, of doubting yourself and finding the courage to continue anyway. She dedicated it, without naming him, to someone who had helped her when she needed help most. A dedication that caused Sinatra to look away briefly, as if the acknowledgement had touched something he preferred to keep hidden. The ovation that followed her final note was everything a debut performer could hope for. 600 people rising to their feet to applaud a young woman who had arrived as an unknown and was leaving as a star. Catherine stood in the spotlight, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the gap between where she had been 90 minutes earlier and where she stood now. She walked off stage to find Sinatra waiting in the wings, his expression one of satisfaction and something that looked almost like pride. He embraced her briefly, an acknowledgement of what they had shared that evening, and told her that she had done well, that she had proven something to herself that no one could ever take away, that she was now a performer in the truest sense of the word. The reviews the following morning were everything her management had hoped for. Critics praising not only her voice, but her stage presence, her emotional connection with the audience, her ability to command attention for 90 minutes without a single moment that felt forced or artificial. None of them knew how close the evening had come to disaster, how the woman they praised had been lying on a dressing room floor 45 minutes before the curtain rose. Catherine Rose Delgado's career unfolded over the following decades, with the steady trajectory of someone who had faced her greatest fear and survived it. She recorded albums, toured internationally, and built a following among audiences who appreciated the emotional authenticity that characterized every performance she gave. The terror she had experienced that first night never fully disappeared, but it never again controlled her the way it had in those terrible minutes before Sinatra appeared in her dressing room. She and Sinatra maintained a friendship that lasted until his death, a bond forged in crisis that deepened through years of mutual respect and occasional collaboration. He invited her to open for him at several concerts, opportunities that introduced her to audiences who might otherwise never have discovered her work. She credited him publicly with saving her career before it began, a debt she could never fully repay, but that she acknowledged at every opportunity. The story of what happened backstage at the Sands that September night became part of both their legends, told and retold in interviews and biographies until the details sometimes varied, but the essential truth remained constant, that a young woman had collapsed under the weight of her fear, and that Frank Sinatra had helped her rise and carry her to the stage where she discovered who she was meant to be. Catherine learned from that experience that the body's weaknesses could be overcome by the spirit's determination, that panic was a visitor rather than a permanent resident in the mind, and that asking for help was not a sign of weakness, but a recognition that no one achieves anything meaningful entirely alone. She shared these lessons with young performers she mentored throughout her career. The dressing room where she collapsed was eventually renovated and renamed in honor of a performer whose identity Catherine never learned, erasing the physical location of her crisis while the memory remained vivid in her mind. She visited the Sands whenever she performed in Las Vegas, walking the corridor from dressing room to stage as a kind of pilgrimage that reminded her of how far she had traveled from the terrified girl on the floor. Frank Sinatra's willingness to help an unknown performer was characteristic of a generosity that his public reputation for temperament often obscured. He had helped many artists during his career, offering opportunities and endorsements that launched careers that might otherwise never have achieved success. But Catherine's case was different, more intimate, marked by the physical act of helping her stand and walk when her body had failed her. The embrace he offered her in the wings after her triumphant debut became a symbol in her mind of everything mentorship could be, not just advice and opportunities, but presence in moments of crisis, willingness to share the stage with someone who needed support, refusal to abandon a fellow artist when abandonment would have been easier and more convenient. Catherine's voice evolved over the decades, gaining depth and complexity as she aged, while retaining the emotional power that had captivated audiences from her first professional performance. Critics noted that there was something in her singing that suggested she understood suffering in ways that happier performers never could, a quality that made her interpretations particularly compelling to listeners facing their own difficulties. The panic attacks that had nearly destroyed her debut continued to visit her throughout her career, though with decreasing frequency and intensity, as she developed coping mechanisms that allowed her to function despite the fear that lurked beneath her professional confidence. She spoke openly about her struggles with anxiety, hoping to help other performers who might be experiencing similar challenges. Mental health awareness in the entertainment industry was virtually non-existent in 1963, and performers who struggled with anxiety or depression were expected to simply overcome their difficulties through willpower and professionalism. Catherine's willingness to discuss her experiences helped gradually change this culture, contributing to a broader recognition that psychological struggles were medical issues rather than character flaws. She married in 1968, a union with a music producer named Thomas, who understood the demands of her career and supported her through the challenges that came with maintaining success in an industry that constantly demanded reinvention. They had 2 children together, raising them with an awareness of their mother's profession that sometimes complicated family life, but that also enriched it with experiences most families never encountered. The children grew up knowing Frank Sinatra as their mother's friend and mentor, a relationship that seemed perfectly normal to them until they were old enough to understand the magnitude of his fame and the improbability of his connection to their family. They learned the story of their mother's debut gradually, understanding more deeply with each retelling the chain of events that had led from her collapse to her career. Thomas died in 1995, a loss that devastated Catherine and that she channeled into her most critically acclaimed album, a collection of songs about love and loss that resonated with audiences who recognized the genuine grief behind her performances. The album was dedicated to his memory and to Frank Sinatra, whom she credited with teaching her that art could transform pain into something beautiful. Sinatra's own death in 1998 marked the end of an era for Catherine, the loss of someone who had believed in her before she believed in herself, and who had remained a constant presence throughout the decades of her career. She attended his funeral as one of the many artists whose lives he had touched, grieving not for the legend, but for the friend who had helped her stand when she could not stand alone. The tribute concert she organized in his memory a year after his death brought together performers from multiple generations who had been influenced by his work, or like Catherine, had been personally helped by his generosity during vulnerable moments in their careers. The evening raised money for charities that Sinatra had supported and provided a public acknowledgement of his impact beyond his recorded legacy. Catherine performed 3 songs during the tribute concert, selections that showcased her development from the terrified young woman who had frozen backstage to the confident professional who could command any room regardless of the audience's initial expectations. She dedicated her final song to the man who had carried her to the stage, a dedication that brought tears to the eyes of those who knew the story. Her retirement from performing came in 2010, a decision driven by declining health that made the physical demands of live performance increasingly difficult to sustain. She had given thousands of performances over a career spanning nearly 5 decades, each one carrying the echo of that first night when everything had almost ended before it could begin. The memoir she published in 2012 devoted an entire chapter to the events of September 1963, providing details that had never been shared publicly about the depth of her crisis and the specifics of Sinatra's intervention. Readers responded with messages describing their own struggles with anxiety and panic, thanking her for sharing a story that made them feel less alone in their difficulties. Catherine established a foundation in Sinatra's memory that focused on supporting performers struggling with mental health challenges, providing resources that had not existed when she experienced her breakdown, and that might have helped her avoid the crisis that brought her to the floor of that dressing room. The foundation continues to operate today, helping artists who need support, but who are reluctant to ask for it. The Sands Hotel where it all happened was demolished in 1996, replaced by the Venetian resort that bears no physical memory of the nights when Frank Sinatra held court in the Copa Room and occasionally helped frightened young performers find their courage. But the stories survive, passed down through entertainment history as evidence of what becomes possible when someone powerful chooses to help someone vulnerable. Catherine Rose Delgado died on November 14, 2021, at the age of 81, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried forward the legacy of perseverance and faith that she had demonstrated throughout her remarkable life. Her obituary mentioned her connection to Frank Sinatra prominently, recognizing it as the turning point that had made everything else possible. The dress she wore on her debut night was donated to a museum of entertainment history, displayed alongside a photograph of Sinatra leading her onto the stage, and a plaque explaining the significance of the moment it represented. Visitors often pause before the exhibit, imagining what it must have felt like to collapse in fear and then rise to triumph with the help of a legend. Her grandchildren inherited not only her musical talents, but also her commitment to helping others, a value that she traced directly to the generosity that Frank Sinatra had shown her when she had nothing to offer in return except her potential and her willingness to try despite her terror. The lesson she passed down was simple. When you have the power to help someone, use it, because you never know how far the ripples of your kindness might extend. The 40 yards between the dressing room and the stage at the Sands no longer exist in physical form, erased by the demolition that transformed the landscape of Las Vegas entertainment. But in the mythology of performance, that distance remains sacred, a journey from darkness to light that Catherine traversed with Frank Sinatra's hand supporting her when her own strength was insufficient. The whispered words that Sinatra spoke to her in the wings before walking onto the stage remained Catherine's secret throughout her life, a private treasure that she chose not to share even when interviewers pressed for details about that legendary night. She believed that some things were too precious to be transformed into public content, that the power of certain moments depended on their remaining protected from the world's consuming curiosity. Her final concert, performed in Las Vegas in 2009, included a spoken tribute to Sinatra that brought the audience to tears as she described what he had meant to her and to her career. She told them that she would not be standing on that stage without his intervention, that the woman they were applauding owed her existence as a performer to a man who had refused to let her fail when failure seemed inevitable. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes, an acknowledgement not just of the performance they had witnessed, but of the entire journey that had brought Catherine from the floor of a dressing room to the pinnacle of her profession. She stood in the spotlight, tears streaming down her face, remembering the night when a similar spotlight had seemed like a threat rather than a celebration. The recording career that followed Catherine's triumphant debut produced 12 studio albums over 25 years, each one showcasing different aspects of a voice that critics described as both powerful and vulnerable, capable of commanding attention while simultaneously inviting intimacy. Her debut album, released in early 1964, featured several songs she had performed that first night, captured in a studio with production values that enhanced rather than obscured the natural qualities of her instrument. Capitol Records, the label that had signed her following her Sands debut, invested heavily in promoting an artist they believed could compete with the established female vocalists who dominated the adult contemporary market. The marketing campaign emphasized her story without revealing the details of her backstage crisis, presenting her as a fresh voice from Texas who had been discovered and mentored by industry professionals who recognized extraordinary talent. The second album explored more ambitious territory, incorporating orchestral arrangements that showcased Catherine's ability to interpret complex material with emotional intelligence that belied her relative inexperience. Critics noted that she had matured significantly between recordings, developing a confidence in the studio that matched what audiences witnessed during her live performances. Sinatra's influence on her career extended beyond that first night, manifesting in phone calls and occasional meetings during which he offered advice about navigating an industry that could be as cruel as it was rewarding. He warned her about managers who would try to exploit her success, about producers who would prioritize commercial considerations over artistic integrity, about the loneliness that fame could create even when surrounded by people who claimed to care. She listened to his guidance with the attention of someone who understood that wisdom was being offered from a source whose experience was unmatched in their industry. He had made mistakes that she could avoid, had learned lessons that he was willing to share, had survived decades in a business that destroyed most of those who entered it with dreams of stardom. The relationship between them was never romantic, despite speculation from gossip columnists who could not imagine a connection between a famous man and a young woman that was not based on physical attraction. What they shared was deeper and more durable, a bond between mentor and protégé that was rooted in a moment of crisis when one person's presence had made all the difference to another person's survival. Catherine's first major tour began in 1965, a 3-month journey across America that tested her ability to perform consistently night after night, in venues that ranged from intimate clubs to theaters seating thousands. The stamina required was unlike anything she had experienced during her Las Vegas performances, and she struggled initially to maintain the energy levels that audiences expected from a rising star. The panic attacks continued during this period, striking without warning and threatening to derail performances that she had committed to deliver. She developed coping mechanisms that allowed her to function despite the terror that lurked beneath her professional composure, breathing techniques and mental exercises that she could deploy when she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that signaled an approaching crisis. Her mother traveled with her during the first tour, providing a stabilizing presence that helped Catherine navigate the disorienting experience of waking up in different cities every few days, never quite certain where she was or how she had arrived there. The logistics of touring were handled by a team of professionals, but the emotional support could only come from someone who had known her before she became famous. The West Texas childhood that had shaped Catherine's character provided a foundation of resilience that served her well during the challenging early years of her career. She had grown up in a family that valued hard work and perseverance, that expected setbacks and responded to them with determination rather than despair. These values had been tested by her Backstage collapse, but had ultimately proven strong enough to support her recovery. Her father, an oilfield worker who had never imagined his daughter would become a professional entertainer, attended her concerts whenever his schedule permitted, sitting in audiences filled with people who had no idea that the proud man in the inexpensive suit was the father of the woman commanding the stage. His presence grounded her, reminding her of who she had been before fame transformed her into someone the world wanted pieces of. The television appearances that began in 1966 introduced Catherine to audiences who might never have encountered her through albums or live performances. She appeared on variety shows hosted by the biggest names in entertainment, demonstrating a camera presence that translated her stage charisma into the intimate medium of home screens. Each appearance expanded her audience and solidified her position as a rising star. Sinatra watched her television performances and called afterward with feedback that was always honest and sometimes difficult to hear. He praised what worked and criticized what did not, understanding that genuine mentorship required truth rather than empty flattery that might feel good in the moment but would ultimately hinder her development as an artist. The Grammy nomination that arrived in 1967 validated everything Catherine had worked toward since that terrifying night when she had lain on the floor of a dressing room, believing her career was over before it began. The nomination was for Best New Artist, a category that recognized the impact she had made during her first years in the industry and that positioned her alongside peers who had already achieved significant commercial success. She did not win the award, but the nomination itself opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed and established her credibility with industry professionals who measured artists by the recognition they received from their peers. Catherine understood that the journey was more important than any single destination, and that a nomination represented progress even if victory remained elusive. The late 1960s brought changes to the music industry that challenged artists of Catherine's generation, as rock music rose to dominance and the sophisticated vocal style she had developed faced competition from sounds that seemed alien to everything she had been trained to deliver. She adapted by incorporating contemporary elements into her arrangements, while maintaining the emotional authenticity that had always been her signature quality. Her marriage to Thomas in 1968 provided stability during a period when professional pressures might otherwise have overwhelmed her. He understood the demands of her career because he worked within the same industry, producing albums for artists whose challenges mirrored those Catherine faced. Their partnership was built on mutual respect and shared understanding of the sacrifices that success required. The birth of their first child in 1970 tested Catherine's commitment to her career in ways that Sinatra had warned her about during their conversations. She took 3 months away from performing, the longest break since her debut, and struggled with guilt about leaving her infant with caregivers, while she traveled to fulfill obligations that could not be postponed without damaging the momentum she had built. Thomas proved to be the partner she needed, managing household responsibilities during her absences and never making her feel that she was failing as a mother, by pursuing the career that had been saved from destruction by Frank Sinatra's intervention 7 years earlier. Their partnership endured challenges that destroyed other marriages in the entertainment industry. The second child arrived in 1973, and Catherine had learned to balance the demands of motherhood with the requirements of a career that she was unwilling to abandon, despite the guilt that sometimes accompanied leaving her children with nannies while she traveled to perform for audiences in distant cities. She scheduled tours around school calendars when possible, bringing her children along during summer months. The 1970s represented the peak of Catherine's commercial success, a decade during which she released 4 albums that achieved gold certification and performed to sold-out audiences across America and Europe. Her voice had matured, gaining depth and complexity that enhanced rather than replaced the raw emotional power that had captivated audiences from her first professional performance. The relationship with Sinatra deepened during these years, as both artists navigated the challenges of aging in an industry that worshipped youth. They spoke regularly about the compromises required to remain relevant, the adaptation necessary to reach new audiences, while maintaining connections with fans who had supported them from the beginning. His retirement in 1971 affected Catherine deeply, representing the potential end of an era that had defined her understanding of what excellence in their industry looked like. She attended his farewell concert, watching from the audience as the man who had carried her to her first stage took his final bow, and she wept with an intensity that surprised even herself. His return to performing in 1973 brought relief that she had not anticipated, confirmation that the voice she had grown up admiring would continue to be heard, and that the man who had saved her career would remain a presence in her life and in the industry they both served. She called to welcome him back, and he received her congratulations with characteristic gruffness that concealed genuine pleasure. The tribute concert she organized for his 70th birthday in 1985 brought together performers from multiple generations whose careers had been touched by his influence. Catherine served as the event's master of ceremonies, introducing acts that ranged from established legends to newcomers who were just beginning journeys that Sinatra's example had inspired. She performed 3 songs during the evening, including the ballad she had opened with on her debut night at the Sands, a selection that carried layers of meaning that only those who knew the full story could appreciate. Sinatra watched from the audience, visibly moved by the tribute from an artist whose career he had helped launch with an act of kindness that had cost him nothing but a few minutes of his time. After the concert, they shared a private moment backstage that echoed their first encounter over 2 decades earlier. Catherine thanked him again for what he had done, and Sinatra deflected the gratitude with the same gruffness he always displayed when confronted with acknowledgments of his generosity. But his eyes betrayed the emotion he preferred not to express, the pride he felt in what she had become. The final years of Sinatra's life were marked by declining health that gradually reduced his public appearances and eventually silenced the voice that had defined American popular music for half a century. Catherine visited him when she could, conversations that sometimes wandered as his memory failed, but that always returned to music when prompted by songs that had shaped both their lives. She sang for him during one of those visits, performing in his living room the same song she had opened with on her debut night, her voice softer now, but still carrying the emotional power that had convinced him she was worth saving when she lay collapsed on a dressing room floor. He listened with his eyes closed, transported to a night 30 years earlier, when everything had been possible and nothing had yet been lost. The news of Sinatra's death on May 14, 1998, reached Catherine at her home in Los Angeles, where she had been preparing for a concert that she immediately cancelled to mourn the loss of the man who had changed her life. She remained in seclusion for days, emerging only to attend the funeral, where she sat with others whose lives had been transformed by his presence. She spoke at a memorial service held weeks later, sharing the full story of their first meeting for the first time with an audience that included family members and close friends who had heard various versions over the years, but who listened with fresh appreciation as she described the moment when everything had changed. The foundation she established in his memory focused on supporting performers struggling with stage fright and performance anxiety, providing resources that might help others avoid the crisis that had nearly destroyed her career before it began. The foundation continues to operate, helping artists who need support, but who are reluctant to ask for help in an industry that often punishes vulnerability. Catherine's own health declined in her final years, the cumulative toll of decades of performing, catching up with a body that had given everything to audiences who had loved her for what she offered. She gave her final concert in 2009, a farewell performance in Las Vegas that brought her career full circle to the city, where it had nearly ended before beginning. The memoir she published in 2012 devoted an entire chapter to the events of September 1963, providing details that had never been shared publicly about the depth of her crisis and the specifics of Sinatra's intervention. Readers responded with messages describing their own struggles, thanking her for sharing a story that made them feel less alone. Her grandchildren gathered around her in her final months, listening to stories about a great-grandfather they had never met and about a legendary entertainer whose connection to their family had shaped everything that followed. They understood that they existed partly because Frank Sinatra could not walk past a young woman in crisis without stopping to help. Rest in peace, Catherine Rose Delgado. Your voice deserved to be heard, and thanks to one man's refusal to let you surrender to your fear, it was heard by audiences across 5 decades who never knew how close they came to never experiencing your gift. And rest in peace, Francis Albert Sinatra. The voice that defined an era also lifted another voice that September night, literally carrying a fallen performer to the stage where she discovered who she was meant to be. What you did in that dressing room proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to continue despite it. And the young woman you helped stand never forgot the lesson you taught her with your presence when everyone else was ready to give up.